Dimitri, are we on? Yes, excellent stuff. All right. Hello and welcome to the second Habitable Planet Workshop online panel discussion of the 2018 workshop. A very warm welcome to everyone out there who's part of the course this year, and especially to those joining us in the group sessions. I know we have a big group up at the University of Venda, UFH, both of the UK ZNs this time, Pietermaritzburg and Westville. I've seen on the message board that Zululand are having some trouble joining us. I hope you guys get yourself sorted, or if not, you get a chance to watch this through at a later date. And so, welcome once again. As you all know, my name's Carl Palmer. I'm the Access Education Program Manager, and it's my pleasure as part of that job to introduce these sessions. I have with me once again today an excellent panel who are going to go through and discuss your questions on the course. You submitted your questions as part of the week 5 exam, but I'm well aware that some of the course has in many ways progressed since then, and that also questions do come up as we are going along. And this is meant to be an interactive session. Part of the point of it is for you to actually have a chance to quiz the panel. So I'm sure you're aware that if you look at the side of your screen, I am guessing it's on that side of your screen as you're looking at it. You should be able to see there's a space on YouTube for you to ask questions. Or the second way that you can get involved is via the WhatsApp group. I've got my phone here. Dr. Neville, who you met last time and will introduce himself now, is also on the WhatsApp group to get your questions there. We are going to do, before I get the panel to introduce themselves, we are going to introduce one little novelty to the format this time that we didn't last time. And that's that by popular demand, we will take a 5-minute break halfway through for everyone to grab some snacks. So, so we will be doing that, and hopefully that will help people concentrate moving forward. Lastly, before I introduce today's expert panel, just to remind you that I will do my absolute best with pronunciation of names. I am, however, from England, so I am equally unfamiliar with African and Afrikaans names, and I will probably murder them all equally. So I'm an equal opportunities name murderer, but I will do my utmost best. And so yeah, to bring us to the panel this week, I'm going to ask each of the members to give a little bit of a background to themselves, and to also answer Tshiamo Moleele's question as to what keeps them motivated to do what they do besides just passion. I'll start in the studio, and I guess to my far right, Dimitri, do you want to tell the group something about yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Dimitri Veldkornet. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of the Western Cape. I'm originally from the Eastern Cape. My research focuses on estuaries and their responses to climate change. What drives me besides passion can only be passion. So that's it.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Romala Govender. I am a Cenozoic paleontologist based at Iziko Museums of South Africa, Cape Town, the Natural History Museum. And I study fossil whales, dolphins, porpoises, and seals from the west coast of Southern Africa. And part of my study is to understand why there's been a change in the fauna over the past 5 million years. What are the causes and what are the consequences of those causes over the past 5 million years? And what keeps me motivated other than passion is the question why, and the fact that every day that you work in a paleontological question, you come across something new and interesting. And the stuff I work with is like doing a 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, but you don't have all the pieces.
Did you always want to be a paleontologist? It's quite a niche thing to get into.
It is quite a niche thing. No, actually, I always wanted to be a vet. So hence, I couldn't be a vet, so I worked with animals in a different way. So I keep the contact working with animals. But what interests me the most about paleontology, like I said, it's a 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, but you don't have the full picture and you don't have all the pieces. So you take what you have and you have to extrapolate and reach conclusions or make more hypotheses that you can test, and somebody else will come along and maybe find more information from a different point of view and answer the question for you.
Okay, and I'll let you off in 1 minute. But the one last thing, I know that there's lots of students out there who are doing biology and possibly honours level, undergraduate level. How easy is it to get into paleontology? Because it's a fascinating thing to actually go and discover.
Well, it depends on how interested you are. At UCT, the biological sciences, at an honours level, there are projects available for people to do paleontology, and then at a master's and a PhD level. But if you want to go the more structured route, then you would look at the at WITS, what used to be the Bernard Price Institute, now the Evolutionary Studies Institute there. And they have a structured honours course for paleontology, as well as you can go on to do masters, PhD and postdocs and all of that.
Great, thank you. Neville?
Hi, so hello everybody. I've met you before, or most of you, at least some of you have just attending for the first one. And I originally started as a marine biologist, working in a similar area to you. Oh, sorry, switch that off. Working in a similar area to geographically. And my work is in molecular science, application to fisheries. But now I'm paid to be a science manager. I run Access, but I also do other kinds of research related to climate. Passion is one thing, and I think that's important. In fact, I think it's fundamental. Given that, and assuming that, I'm middle-aged now. I'm 54, to my surprise and shock, and I think like all things, one has to have a career, and I think it's important that I think for many of you who are young, those things are not priorities really. I mean, I think you want to follow your heart and you want to do what you can do, find things that are interesting. But for me, I can tell you that as a, shall we say, mid-career to mid-late career scientist, the things that are important, I think, are that what you do in life must be meaningful and purposeful. And I mean, many of us don't have that opportunity, and it's a great privilege to be able to do that. And so I would say it's passion, purpose, meaning, and an ability to pay the bills.
Which is always important.
Which is critical, especially when you're my age and have children.
It's incumbent upon me to apologise to Neville. I didn't tell him about the Cape Town pink and white dress code today, so I'm sorry about that. Beyond Cape Town, we're very lucky to be joined by 2 members of the panel from elsewhere in the country. I'll do ladies first. Guys, please remember to unmute your microphone before starting. But Noabisa, could you please just say a couple of words about yourself?
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm unmuted.
You're great.
Oh, okay. Hi, guys. So my name is Noabisa Mkhize, and I am a master's student for environmental sciences. And what motivates me, I'm not sure actually. I'm still trying to find motivation. But for now, I can just say maybe the ability to provide for my family and find my passion, I guess. Yeah.
I'll pick up on that, Lisa.
Sorry?
I mean, if you want to provide for your family, I would always say this, then go and be an accountant. That's going to earn you the most money, but it's going to be boring, right?
I tried doing accounting. I wasn't really good at it, so yeah.
I want to just say that,
okay, thanks, Nobisa.
That making lots of money or making the most amount of money and being able to provide for your family are 2 different things.
That's true, I guess. A secure career, a stable career is something that science does offer. Dr. Kabir.
Hi, my name is Kabir. I'm from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I work for SAPI Forest South Africa, and I'm coming in live from Tweedy in KwaZulu-Natal. I've done my PhD in environmental science, GIS and remote sensing. I work in vegetative propagation, so how can we improve our planting practices and producing more plants for SAPI to plant. In terms of motivation, I think it's science. How does science transfer to society, improve the youth of today? And yeah, I think this is one of the things that we're doing right here today. That's just proof of the pudding.
Okay, Kabir, for those who don't know, can you just tell them exactly where you are in the country?
So
nobody will know that specific location.
So KwaZulu-Natal, the city of choice, Pietermaritzburg. Howick is not too far from Pietermaritzburg. It's about 40 minutes. And it's close by the Nelson Mandela capture site. So if anybody visited there, I'm like a few minutes away. Nice. In the heart of the Midlands, I'd say.
It's a beautiful area by all accounts as well. So I'm quite jealous, although Cape Town does have its merits too.
So if you guys are coming close by the capture site, please drop me a WhatsApp or a mail and come and visit.
I have a career story to tell about Howick, which I want to share because it's very personal, but I think it might be a lesson there. I was at a meeting in Howick at Wildlife or something as a premises there, and there was a job going which I thought was way beyond my ability to do, and I forgot to apply. And then I was lying in bed in Howick, and then something made me get out of bed and go to the lab and write an application for this job, which I got ultimately, to my surprise and shock and horror, actually. And I really felt the job was way beyond my reach. But what I found was that I was able to grow into that job. And the reason I'm telling you that story is because it's something I want to tell young people, that you must reach way beyond what you think are your abilities. You must be ambitious, because often it's the opportunity that is the key, not necessarily only the ability. So don't doubt yourself. That's my Howick story.
Thank you very much, Neville. All right, we'll press on with the science. As always, what's the main reason the panel are here is to answer your questions. We normally go through the questions in the sequence of the Habitable Planet lectures, but having looked at your questions this week, I think last week there was this big group of questions all around the Big Bang. That seemed to be something that really fascinated people. And this time, once again, there's a topic that seems to have really captured the imagination of the Planeteers out there. And that topic is sort of the origins of life, but it goes a little bit into the plants and photosynthesis and how photosynthesis started, and a little bit into paleoscience. So I've kind of I've created a special section where at the start here, we're going to roll in a little bit from a few of the different lectures that all focus around this origins of life and photosynthesis story. So I've called that our little special section on origins. We'll do that, and then we'll pick up the ones that do pertain to the lectures and don't quite fit into that story afterwards. So we get to your questions, and we'll have a look. The first one on that is a very fundamental one, and I am aware that in the origins of life, we did have a look at this already, but I'm also aware that I have an expert next to me, so I'm going to do it anyway. And so I'm going to ask Ramallah, how did life emerge on Earth? And that's a question from Mashtlongonolo Mashtera.
Okay, so I'm not going to go back and discuss 3.5 billion years ago when there were just bacteria and the Earth's atmosphere wasn't conducive to being habitable. I'm going to talk about the transition to land and what happened over 400 million years ago that made these animals suddenly change the way they functioned. And one of the most important things that happened is that there was the development of jaws, where things were living off chemical functions before. Now you suddenly had animals living that had jaws. And then during the Ordovician, we had and then during the Devonian, you had all these beautiful plants arrive. Not like we see today, but plants that were living near ponds and all of that. And suddenly there were insects developing, and suddenly there was this new food source that was available to these animals. And here they were stuck in water. They couldn't go far away because they needed water to drink, they needed water to stay hydrated, they needed water to reproduce. So what do? How does this change of this environment affect the animals? So what happens is that these animals have now found this new source. They go out, grab what they want, get back to water, and suddenly realize that they have to move further away. So speaking very colloquially. And what happened was that we see a change in the animal's way of life. So in water, the body doesn't need any kind of muscle structure or strong muscles, because water basically buoys the body up. When you move on to land, you suddenly find that the body needs muscles that are able to keep structure. You need bones that are more solidly built to keep the structure, and the animal needs to be able to move. The next step is actually being able to breathe this air and use this air. So these early tetrapods, or four-footed animals, as they became known, would have needed to breathe in through using lungs, or a system that allowed gills to be ventilated initially. And they may have used buccal pumps, which is actually opening and closing the mouth in order to get air into the lungs. The next big step for them would be to prevent desiccation or drying out. So you have the development of a semi-permeable skin, which allows the animal to move further away from a water source for a longer period of time. And then you need the ability to feed on these new and different insects, such as cockroaches and millipedes that were suddenly available. So you had the development of a jaw. But most importantly, the animals needed a way to reproduce without having to run back to water every time they needed to do this. And there you have the development of the cladoic or amniotic egg. This basically is a private pond in which an embryo can develop. So you have the hard outer shell, which is semi-permeable, that allows exchange of gaseous exchange. You have the amnion fluid, which acts as a shock absorber. You have the yolk, which provides food, as well as you have waste material being taken away. And what this allowed the animal to do is to skip a step. So you go from the embryo straight to the adult without having that larval time where it actually had to spend time in water in order to grow to become an adult. So you actually skip that phase by having the embryo have its own private pond in which it develops. And then the other thing that had to develop was the animal's ability to hear on land. So you have a change in the size of the air bones, and particularly the stapes become smaller, so the animal could now hear high-frequency sound in air. So that's just a little bit of something that animals needed to do in order to colonize land after having lived in water for so long.
Okay, so we're interpreting the question, how did the animals emerge onto the earth itself out of the oceans? When I first read it, thought that they were asking how did life first emerge, full stop, but we'll come to that. But so just quickly, I didn't know this. Are you saying then that animals were the first to come out of the oceans?
Well,
had plants done that before?
Plants had started growing. That's what actually led to animals suddenly having a new food source. So you had the plants coming out during the Devonian. Suddenly you had around these little lakes and seas and inland seas, you had these plants growing that were using the water as a source, but were growing further away from the water itself. So the animals suddenly had to move a certain distance to be able to access this new food source.
Okay, sure. And so then more and more adaptations are needed
to be able to.
The longer the plants go, then you need to actually.
And also, the further your food source moves away, particularly insects, when you have flying insects and insects that can move on the ground are moving further away to these new plants that are growing further away. You need to be able to follow that food source.
And that obviously confers an advantage if you can go further.
Yes. And reduce your dependence on water. To have it all the time. So you can drink and spend 3 or 4 hours away and come back and drink again is an advantage to somebody who has to drink water and then 2 minutes come back and drink water again.
I'll just state the obvious here. When you talk about these developments, we're talking about millions and millions of years between each little step in that process, right? So one individual as part of a community or a family might have got the somehow innate genetic ability to go a couple of centimeters more than its other family. It does better, breathes more, and so on and so forth.
A prime example of that is Tiktaalik, which is called a transitional fossil for that reason. It actually is a link between tetrapods, which means 4 feet, and the lobe fin fishes, which are considered So what lobe fin fishes were able to do was prop themselves in the mud on their fins.
Right.
And then the next step was, okay, I can do this, now I need to move. So what makes Tiktaalik special is that, you know, fish, that's the head and that's the forelimb.
Yeah.
What makes Tiktaalik special, it's developed a neck. So now the shoulder can move independently.
Okay, so,
it has a wrist, it has
Yeah.
the forearm similar to, we had the two bones.
Okay.
So now it's able to prop itself up.
Okay.
It has a rib cage that's capable of breathing air, but it still has scales and it has gills. So it's still dependent on water, but it's able to move onto land.
So last quick one on this one is that in your work, you often have, I'm just guessing here, tell me if I'm right or wrong,
Yeah.
you have a couple of examples of this process. You don't have all the records. So in other words, you don't have every single step in the process.
No.
You have one here, one here, one
Yes.
over there, and you have to infer quite reasonably that from this to there had to have had some transitions, and
Yes.
so this is the
Well,
process.
the fossil record will never be complete because a fossil has to have very specific conditions to form.
Sure.
And not every animal falls into those conditions where it's buried immediately and in an anaerobic environment and all the steps it needs to take to get to being a fossil. But what we do have is significant transitions or changes that have occurred in the skeleton that we see along the way in the fossil record. So we're going, okay, if this happened here and that happened there,
Yes.
what
Must have
what
happened.
is the hypothesized change that occurred
Understand.
in between? It's, you know, the same argument with
No, I say I would
archaeologists.
say one more. So quickly, last one is that there are vestiges of these evolutionary changes in existing animals, right?
Yes, yes,
So, for example, we might have bits and pieces in our bodies which are no longer used,
yes,
but they are vestiges of what was used
yes,
once, right?
yes.
Yeah.
Well, for 9 months you breathe water.
Right.
Yes, very true.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's a means of,
That's an example.
that's an example.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, excuse me, I'm coughing a bit. Good. Okay, so just taking one step back then, you could interpret that question as to where did life on Earth come from? And obviously we had a whole lecture on that, so I'm not going to go too far into it. But just one quick question. Chuster and Glavu asks, if all life occurred from a single cell, does that mean that all life has the same lineage? And the answer is a distinct yes. That's exactly what it infers. And really, you know, that comes back to Charles Darwin, when he made his observations, came to the conclusion that all life should have lineage back to a single ancestor. And everything that's gone after Charles Darwin has reaffirmed that hypothesis to the point now that we are very, very confident that the blueprint for life all comes from one single ancestor at some point, although we don't know what that was.
Question to you, Carl. Is it not possible that life evolved twice?
I mean, it's possible, but is it probable? Is the answer, right? We talked in the Origins of Life talk about the primordial conundrum that life needs basically two miracles to happen for DNA and for proteins to form, which doesn't seem likely, right? And then we even factoring in geological time, those two very complex molecules forming at once seems incredibly unlikely. There's this idea that we discussed in the talk about how RNA might have been able to fulfill both functions, but nonetheless, the crossing from the abiotic to the biotic seems such an unlikely event that even in geological time, you would imagine that we're pushing it to say that it happened once, let alone that it happened more than once. Sort of linking into that actually quite nicely is Morpone Ampashlas's question, which is, why is the universe so exquisitely balanced such that life can exist? That's a question which comes up a lot. I mean, physicists have actually noticed that the fundamental forces that govern the universe have to be exactly as they are for the universe to exist as it is. If gravity was just a little bit stronger, the Big Bang would have imploded in on itself. If the strong nuclear force was just a little bit weaker, atoms wouldn't hold together. But I would answer that question with a big word, and then I'll explain it, that it may well be just that it's tautological. And it's kind of like asking, why is the sun at just the perfect wavelength for our eyes to use it? It's not that, it's the other way around. Our eyes have developed because the sun produces light at that wavelength. And I would argue that life within this universe has developed in the way it has through the process of evolution because of the way the universe is. Life has developed to be to be adapted to this current planet and to this current universe. And had the universe, and some physicists, as we talked about in the Big Bang, believe this might have happened, that there may be different universes with different physical parameters. Had the physical parameters been different, then life would be very different. And you know, I might be talking to you now with 6 heads and being made of plasma and not being made of atoms or something, but we're not. We're in this universe. So moving on then, in the story of the beginnings of life, there's been a lot of questions about the start of photosynthesis, which happens a little bit along down the road, before emerging out onto the land, right? But after the origins of life. Lifa Matua asks, where did cyanobacteria come from, and how exactly did they come to life?
Well, I actually thought this was a very interesting question, because it's not something I've looked at myself. So I thought I'd give it a bash to see if I could teach myself something as well as teach everybody else, or at least get them looking at the question. And it starts at about 2.7 billion years, where the sulfur in the oceans show that there's a production of oxygen. There's also iron present in the soil and on the ocean floor, which also suggests production of oxygen. So you've got this oxygen, which is rising in the amount that is present. And to the animals that are actually present at the time, it's actually dangerous and deadly. It's actually going to kill them. So along come the cyanobacteria, which have undergone a chemical change, which allowed them to actually use these building blocks to actually metabolize the CO2 and all of that around them and produce oxygen, which would then reach a level, it took over 1 billion years to reach a level that could actually allow life to begin on Earth as we know it now, as we see the end product. But cyanobacteria are alive today and actually are a very intricate part of ecological systems, because they help fix nitrogen as well in the soil, and that helps the plants when getting nutrients together and during photosynthesis.
Fixing nitrogen, producing oxygen. They're quite rebels, hey?
But they, as usual, the rebels that change the world for the better.
That's quite interesting. Okay, then, so the cyanobacteria, they're the first to produce. Lufano Razila asks, is it scientifically proven that they were the first to produce oxygen and cause the catastrophe?
Okay, so, you know, cyanobacteria, bacteria, they, as you said, evolved quite early on. Has it been scientifically proven? I think the question is there been experiments done to determine if it was
what's the evidence?
So the evidence that we do have is stromatolites. So if you go to coastal, shallow coastal regions, you'll see these layers of sediment, of sand that has been deposited, and then you have organic material, and some of them include cyanobacteria. And that's millions of years, actually 2.7 to 2.5 million years is the guess. So those rocks are dead old. Yeah. So if you can date the rock,
billions, right?
Billions,
not
yes.
millions. That's a really difficult number to get your head around.
So essentially, if you can date the age of the rock, you can date the age of the organism that's within the rock. There's also genome sequencing, because chloroplasts and chloroplasts plants, they inherited chloroplasts from cyanobacteria. So there's a lineage where you can track up to today's oldest or today's youngest plant. So you can do gene sequencing and date the genome or the sequences that you have, and that will give you a rough estimate of how old cyanobacteria is. So you can sequence the genes that is within cyanobacteria.
So what you're saying is that genetics can tell us that cyanobacteria had the chloroplast first and then gave it to the other stuff?
Yes.
Okay.
So, as Ramallah said earlier, one of the problems we've got in reconstructing the past is you don't have every record of every step. So And another problem in science is we never know what we don't know. We know there's some things we don't know, but we don't know what we don't know in many cases. So they're called unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
So what we have is we have evidence, we have data, and in between those bits and pieces, we have to put in theory, or at least hypothesis. And when we can, we try to test those, but in many cases, as you just guys have been discussing, these things are not preserved. So indeed, the oldest ones, as you've just pointed out, are the cyanobacteria. If there was a singular organism floating around that managed to fix nitrogen or carbon into a molecule and use it as a food source before that, which was not preserved, we'll never know.
Yeah.
So as far as we know, you're right, of course. There's always a possibility it happened another way.
Yes.
I would argue.
But I mean, the evidence at the minute is quite strongly.
Oh, no. There's no doubt. These are, if not the earliest, then very early.
Well, they're probably close to.
Precisely. Much closer to the origin
Yes.
than anything else that we know of.
Okay, nice one. Sareshni Govender asks about the cyanobacteria. If they cause this oxygen catastrophe, they produce the first oxygen, and at the time oxygen was a deadly poison to the organisms present. There was none of it on the planet. Then how did they survive? What do we think that they did differently which allowed them to survive and all the other organisms died?
Okay, so I've been given this question and I've been giving it a tremendous amount of thought, and I did a lot of research. No, I didn't. I chatted to Carl about it today, and I'm hoping that Romala can help me perhaps with thinking about this one. It's a really nice question and intuitive. If oxygen is poisonous and you're producing it, why aren't you killing yourself, right? Yeah. So I think the first answer is that oxygen is highly reactive, okay?
Yeah.
Secondly, we're talking about processes that happen over very long periods of time, right? So this one type of organism, cyanobacterium, would have changed within its time frame before it evolved further. It's highly likely that the amounts of oxygen it originally produced were very low.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
And that it was able to metabolize that, or the environment in which it lived, or even within the cell, would have been metabolized. So it wouldn't have become self-toxic immediately. So I think there was probably enough evolutionary time for it to cope with that.
Well, the one study I was reading, astrobiology paper, was they spoke about they also looked at genetics and trying to link cyanobacteria to this great oxidation event. And then what they suggested is that it took over 1 billion years for oxygen levels to reach a stage where it would have been poisonous. That's more than enough time for them to have developed a way of beating.
You're talking about 1,000 million years, right? 1,000 million years. So that's true. But I mean, look, at the cellular level, a small amount of oxygen could be toxic. For the atmosphere to fill up, all of the oxidation had to have happened. The oceans had to rust and all that kind of stuff, okay, before it became concentrated in the atmosphere. So there's a long period. But I mean, at the microscopic level, these things metabolize. And I think that, any organism that had developed an advantage of some development in the environment would have evolved in that direction. So I think these are slow processes.
But I think, sorry. But also, they lived as colonies.
Yes.
Something else you need to
have a
take
local build.
You need to think about.
Yeah. So plants and cyanobacteria themselves also use oxygen. So at night when there's no carbon dioxide, so during anaerobic respiration they also use
but presumably at that point there was no aerobic respiration, right? Because
they should have had anaerobic respiration first, and then aerobic.
So they might have developed the mechanism simultaneously.
Yes.
Just want to say there's a second part of this question here, which is I hope that kind of addresses that question.
Okay, thank you. We seem to have lost the sound for a minute. Can you just quickly cover for that last question?
Oh, for that question about the cyanobacteria?
Yes.
Summary?
The last bit.
The last bit about, okay, the question was really asking...
No, not the cyanobacteria, the bacteria.
Oh, this. Okay, just bottom line is bacteria are incredibly diversified and they evolve very quickly, and they can live in any different kind of environment, even extreme environments, like highly salty, high temperatures, very cold. So they live in all kinds of environments, as colonies and as individual organisms.
Back to the oxygen, it is also worth pointing out that oxygen remains a deadly toxin to all organisms. In fact, I mean,
Yes.
when a human being dies of quote unquote old age, I mean, really that's oxygen poisoning. And, you know, we have to take antioxidants into our diet in order to help our body continually control the damage that oxygen does. It really is nasty, nasty stuff. On the subject of oxygen and what we know about the early Earth, we had a good couple of questions about the banded iron formations, Nontebeko Sitole and Pila Traeli. Sorted.
No.
Yes.
Apparently it's still on, the sound problem.
I think it's delayed.
Oh, it's back.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay.
So, Elu, Pila, Traeli, and Beku Sitole, one asked what are banded iron formations and why are they important? And the other said, according to Noebisa's core talk, how did banded iron stones in Kimberley form, and does this prove that oxygen started? We're lucky we actually have Noebisa with us, so I'm going to put the question to her first. Noebisa, you're muted. Noebisa, you're muted. You need to unmute yourself first.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So when they were speaking about cyanobacteria and how it was producing oxygen, right? They did before that, like there was lots of so what am I saying? So before oxygen was produced at the time, the Earth itself, like the fossils were like. The fossils before that would have then been like a brown type of color. So then when oxygen was produced, and then it like sort of created like a reddish rusty color. So the banded iron stones, sort of proving that it's sort of like some form of proof, okay, not proof, I think it is, that sort of life began in Africa because they were found in Kimberley, and they are obviously like one of like sort of proof of the fact that oxygen was produced, you know, during that time. So yeah, I think that's why it's important.
Okay, thank you, Noebisa. We also have another guest with us who I'd like to just see if they want to add anything and introduce themselves. Beatrice, are you there? If you're there, say hello. Okay, I'm guessing there's a connection problem, so we'll come back to Beatrice later. Anybody here want to add anything?
No.
Okay, nearly to the end. Just bear with me. We have a question from Kululeko Mazubuko who asks, if life were to be found elsewhere in the universe, would such a species be able to thrive on the planet Earth? It is indeed, as other living organisms do.
Sorry, I got to put my pants down. So I'm trying to interpret that question. The question could mean, would alien life be able to thrive on our Earth? Or it could be alien life be able to thrive on the planet on which it evolved. So if I interpret it as the first question, that really depends. Because if life evolved in a particular place, in a particular environment, that particular environment, so the range of temperatures, the range of pH, the range of pressure, the gravity potentially. I'm talking about invertebrate aquatic life, plant life, as it may be. And also fundamentally, it will depend on the type of metabolism. So our metabolism and our environment, the most common element on the planet is silicon, right? So silicon and carbon are critical elements of organic molecules. And of course, as we've just discussed, oxygen has become a big player in our metabolism. So in these sci-fi movies where you have these highly advanced species all congregating together at the pub somewhere in the sky, right, is highly, highly unlikely. And we know, as an example, if we send a human being to the moon or to Mars, if they don't have a little micro environment which they have to wear or live in, they wouldn't survive. So my short answer is highly unlikely, I imagine. But on the other hand, it is argued that all metabolism, no matter where it is, has to work this way because it's chemically limited. So potentially, I need to add one more thing, and that is that there's, of course, the theory, is it called the Gaia theory? That life on Earth was in fact seeded, panspermia, from alien life in the form of organic molecules and or even primitive bacterial life from elsewhere in space. So in theory, if certain conditions are met, it is possible, right? That alien life could thrive on an alien planet. And then if the second interpretation is, well, there's absolutely no limitation. If life evolves in a particular environment, it should thrive just like life has thrived here.
Yeah, panspermia is the link into the origins of life.
Yes.
Can life survive throughout the universe? Would it be adapted?
And if that's true, we're all alien.
So that is true.
Right.
That's true.
Interestingly, just as an aside, Stephen Hawking recently pointed out before his death that we actually shouldn't be looking for meeting aliens. Should be looking for meeting their robots. It's much more likely that the first thing we meet is actually, because they wouldn't be adapted to our Earth, they would send a robot ahead of themselves.
So let me repeat the question. The question was, if life were to be found elsewhere in the universe, would such species be able to thrive on planet Earth as living organisms on Earth? That was the question which we just answered.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Last question in this special extended session is from Samantha Chetty, who asks, do you think that time, even on geological scale, is enough to produce something as complex as animals and humans from a single cell? Human beings are not just a combination of cells, but a full body working perfectly on its own without even conscious thought of the human mind. Is time, chance, and a combination of chemicals enough to produce this? A very long-winded question, which is principally questioning, again, Darwin's assumption that over geological time we've all come from much more simple organisms. Actually, Darwin wasn't aware, I don't think, of single-cellular organisms, so he might not have imagined it going as far back as that. But I think actually, yeah, it was about concurrent, the theory of evolution and the theory of bacteria, and Lister was working in France. But anyway, and in the way the question is framed, is time, chance, and a combination of chemicals enough to produce this? The answer is, for me, definitely no. But luckily, we don't rely on just chance. And I think that's a common misconception about the idea of evolution, that actually these things just happen by chance. That's not the case, because what's really specifically clever about Darwin's theory of evolution is that he provides a mechanism by which chance can be directed. And that's a big difference from just pure chance. The idea of his survival of the most adapted, the fittest got dropped, it's of the best adapted, via mutations. So first we have the observation that the progeny of animals or of any species actually differ from their parents, but have some similarities. There's an element of chance and an element of genetics being passed on. Once again, Darwin didn't even know about genetics, was quite the fascinating thing. Allows a combination of random chance and selection to work together to drive towards adapting to a given environment. And that's all really life has done since the first single cell. It's a really, really powerful idea that when life gets going, then as soon as there's an advantage to moving to a new environment, which would be immediately inferred once the first environment gets crowded. Then through mutation and then natural selection, this key actually process by which it's not just chance, but that the best adaptations are picked, then organisms can move to fill a different niche and a different niche until you end up with organisms filling every niche on the Earth. And it does seem quite remarkable to think of something like the human brain actually, I mean, firstly, it seems remarkable for the first cell to form from abiotics. Even a cell is an incredibly complicated machine, but something like the human brain forming from simpler and simpler organisms does seem quite incredible, but it's there in the fossil records. I mean, firstly, in genetic studies, we can show that we are related to other species and how close we are related to other species. And then you look back through the fossil record, you can see different hominid ancestors, each with a decreasingly smaller brain size. And then you can go back in the fossil record millions of years and see the brain size decreasing and decreasing. And we actually have some animals that have been existing and are still in the same form for millions, if not hundreds of millions of years. And we can look at their brains and see how they are simpler than our brains. So it seems incredible, but you do have this incredibly strong evidence showing how brains have developed all the way up to the size of a human brain. One interesting thing which I won't answer is if we can see that the human brain is the result of this process of a linear, or not a linear, but of a continual improvement of smaller brains, and that the smaller brains came from nervous systems, more basic nervous systems, and they came from just sensors originally, then that would demonstrate that the human brain is nothing more than a collection of atoms working together, which raises interesting questions about consciousness. But that goes far beyond. We can certainly, for those who come to Polokwane, I'm happy to expound the idea that consciousness is just a property that arises from lots of atoms together.
I just want to say something about the brain, which I find fascinating. It's one of the frontiers of science, which I think remains an enigma. I mean, it's the oceans, it's space, and it's the brain. And the part of the brain that's fascinating is memory. How it's not really well understood. How is memory stored? And how do we access memory? So I can stimulate you in order to remember something which you won't otherwise remember, but it is there, the information. As you walk around, go to sleep, wake up, the memory's still there. Somehow, it's not understood. And there's a guy called Oliver Sacks, if you want to look him up, who writes about brain disorders. And in that book, he's a fascinating author, short stories. He was a doctor. And in that story, he shows how memory is critical for consciousness. If you don't have memory, you can't have consciousness. That's something to ponder. I just want to make one quick remark, Carl, and that was that some of these questions are asking another question in a roundabout way. And that is, there are challenges to the theory of evolution. So if somebody's asking, how is it possible that this happened? What they're really asking is, I don't believe that it just happened by chance, it happened by
But it didn't happen by chance, let's be clear.
Okay, so the strict evolutionists will tell you that there's no role for religion in this argument, it's only science. And all I'm going to say there, I know it's very controversial, is that they're not necessarily incompatible theories, okay? There is a way, if you want. They're not opposing, is what I mean to say, okay? That doesn't, we have to argue about whether one is right, one is wrong relative to the other. That's the point I'm trying to make, okay? So don't be closed-minded to the idea that evolution is a mechanism which can be explained and is a working system of knowledge and understanding of how the world works. It does not exclude a religious interpretation of evolution. That's what I want to say about it.
All right,
Okay.
I'm happy to leave that there. Is there anything questions on the YouTube, Dimitri?
No, nothing.
Okay. Then I'm happy to move on to the second section, which is on the paleoclimate and plate tectonics. Before I go to the questions, Ramallah, I'm just going to put you on the spot and very quickly. The whole course that we're studying is all about why Earth's habitable. Why is paleontology important in understanding why Earth's habitable?
Well, paleontology, by definition, is studying the past. So it's telling us about what the environment, what the conditions, what the climate was like that allowed animals to live. what it is about this time that was special, that allowed these animals to live and evolve in this particular place at this particular time.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And that's actually really nicely linking into the first question, which comes from Bonkikile Simalani. Bonkikile asks that we learned in the lectures that Cape Town used to have a warmer climate like Durban. What caused this to change? And linking into that, how did the Benguela start?
Okay, so let's go back to about 65 million years ago when the Cenozoic, which is the time we're living in now, began. And starting at this time, all the way through, we see a steady cooling over the 66 million years that have passed so far. And what is interesting, especially along the west coast, is that probably about 40 odd million years ago, the Southern Ocean, which is to the south of Africa, was actually between 9 and 15 degrees warmer than it is today. And as time passed, it got cooler and cooler. And one of the things that is believed to be responsible for this is actually the development of ice caps, both in the initially in the southern hemisphere and then in the northern hemisphere. But more importantly, during this time is that you have the opening of the west wind drift forming, and the ocean actually becoming open to the south of South America, and the Antarctic actually becoming thermally isolated with the development of the circum-Antarctic current, which is in the southern oceans. And what is interesting at this time is that about 16 million years ago, we start noticing a change in nanoplankton that lived in northern Namibia. It's an area that's been specifically studied. And you see a change at this time, and then later on, at about 10 million years, you see a change from what they call warm water forms to cold water forms. So the type of animals living in the water at this stage changed to animals that are adapted to living in cold water. Now, to the south, you have cold water that actually sinks, and it actually shares this cold temperature with the water above and below it. And this water actually flows up northwards along the west coast of South Africa towards the equator, and is known as the Benguela current. Now, what happens is that it shares this cooler temperatures with the water above it and the water below it, and it makes nutrients available. And over the past 5 million years, the cooling of the waters around the Western Cape has been so significant, and the amount of nutrients that have been released, it has created this upwelling, which has provided a very rich food source for both seals, the fish that live off the coast, seals, the cetaceans that we see. And this upwelling has lasted the past 5 million years. However, what's interesting is that the animals that lived off the coast 5 million years ago using this nutrient-rich source don't actually live off our coast today. So one of the things we need to understand is what changes have occurred and why these changes have occurred. And this may also be linked to sea level changes as ice caps form and melt and sea levels go higher and lower over time. But the most important thing about the Benguela current, it probably started between 15 and 10 million years ago. It takes cold water from the south up to the equator where it meets the Angolan current. And the highest upwelling occurs offshore due to the west wind drift and the southeastern trade winds. And this is a very rich feeding ground, and that is why even today, it is one of the richest fishing grounds in the world. Hope that answers your question.
Very comprehensive, thank you.
Can I say a little bit about that?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I like to talk. So when I told you about my Howick story earlier on, the job I got was in Namibia, working on the west coast in the upwelling zone. So I'm very privileged to have, I like to say that I attribute my career to the wind, actually, because it was the wind that provides for this upwelling system. As you just said, and I want to emphasize what you said, it's one of the richest ecosystems in the world. You know, we all have this idea of tropical Amazon jungles and so on and so forth. This is the jungle of the ocean. Yeah. Okay. There's one in South America as well, which is actually a bit bigger than ours and richer than ours. But ours is probably the second most productive ecosystem of all ecosystems in the world. And then just to add that sometimes the system fails. And when that happens, the wind stops blowing, and the warm water, as you described with Angola, comes south into Namibia. And it brings with it a different ecosystem, effectively. And it's amazing to see how the ecosystem changes completely. Different fish, some of the seals die because they haven't got food. This may last a season or 2 seasons sometimes. It's like an El Nino.
Yes.
It does happen occasionally. That's what I wanted to add. Thanks.
Nice one. Thanks, Neville. Last question in this section. Bonolo Mokatsi asks, do the IPCC climate simulations take Milankovitch cycles into consideration, and to what extent are they accurate? I'm going to very quickly just have some response to that. On one level, the answer is not really, because you have to remember that Milankovitch cycles take place over the course of, we're looking at 20,000 years, 40,000 years, and 100,000 years. And in climate science, what we're trying to do is predict what's going to happen in 50 years' time. So none of those Milankovitch cycles are going to have progressed significantly enough in the next 50 years for that to be important. Nonetheless, I do know that for the longer term projections, they're going to have to take this into account. And that actually one of the big challenges of climate modeling is to try and reproduce the past climate. So a lot of the climate models nowadays are being actually deliberately designed to try and reproduce past climate in order to demonstrate their ability when it comes to future climate. And one of the interesting things to observe on that is that they don't do very well. We saw just now when we looked at that graph on the screen, there was a big global cooling from about 20 million years ago to about 3 million years ago. And as far as I'm aware, to date, the models really struggle to reproduce that cooling. So yes and no.
So when you say that the models don't do very well, what's the implication of that statement?
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, it gives you less confidence in their ability to predict the future, you would have thought.
And then that would mean you don't need to worry about climate change? Is that the inference? Okay, so I disagree with Carl. That firstly, I think they do simulate pretty well. There's some errors, unquestionably. The younger dryers and the mini, what do they call it, the mini ice age, for example, are accounted for. Perhaps the models don't get them right, or some models don't get them right, but definitely some models do, and they do take an average of models, and that's an issue in and of itself. And I don't think that, I think models are objective and they try to rely on those as objective data, but I don't think that that brings into any doubt whatsoever that we're getting warmer and are going to get warmer as a consequence of global warming caused by anthropogenic CO2. In the bigger picture, however, that the climate has always changed, will always change, that's another story. So it's about really adaptation and finding an objective means to demonstrate.
But I don't want to go too much into it. I don't think they're trying to get the models better. I can't think of the right word for that. In order to determine whether the climate's going to get warmer. I mean, we know it's going to get warmer. It's in trying to determine more specifics than that. Is it going to get stormier? Is it going to get more rainfall? And that's where actually taking the models and reproducing in the past is giving you more confidence in those.
I think that's reasonable.
More specific predictions.
As we said earlier, there are lots of unknown unknowns.
Yes.
We just don't know what we
so
might have to
that's actually what it gets at, right? The fact that it can't reproduce a feature of the past tells us that there are unknown unknowns and that we have to look for them.
Right.
Okay, great. I'm going to very quickly do Origins and Amazing Water section because most of those were covered in the start. Just very quickly because it links into water and it's an interesting question. Kamogelo Moshidi asks, is Earth the only planet that receives rainfall? Kabir, you did circulating atmosphere, so it's over to you for that.
Okay, so the answer to that is that Earth is only the planet that has liquid water in our atmosphere and on our land. So therefore we have rainfall with water. But the other answer is that there are other planets out there, such as Saturn. Saturn's largest moon, which is Titan, it has icy methane storms, thunderstorms. And this is because we have vapor, there's vapor of methane, and it's in its liquid form because of the surface temperature, which is minus 290 degrees. So that then comes down from a gas form into its liquid form, and then it rains onto the surface of Titan. Similar with Mars, we get liquid helium rain. And on Jupiter, we get plasma rain, which you could Google that to see what's the components of that. Lastly, on Venus' atmosphere, it's full of sulfuric acid clouds. So there's a hot sulfuric acid rain. And that's because the planet hovers a temperature of about 894 degrees Celsius. So the answer is that yes, other planets do experience rain, just not in the liquid water form that we experience on Earth.
Nice one. Thank you, Kabir. That was lovely. And this last question in the section before we break for tea. I put it in this section because I assume it's going to involve water. I hope so. But the question is, how does the moon influence life on Earth? That's from Vukile Jula and Dimitri.
Okay, so the moon and the sun have a gravitational force between each other. So that means at some point the moon and the sun pull each other towards each other, and the water bodies on Earth. So the water bodies gets pulled closer to the moon. So that is when you get tides in oceans and in rivers and in some water bodies. So you also get the extreme neap tide when the sun and the moon is aligned towards the Earth. That is when there's a lot of area uncovered. And then there's the other side of it is when there's a high tide, extreme high tide. Now some plants and animals have adapted to living in the intertidal areas. So when you go to the beach, you'll see the rocky shores, the sandy beaches. So on the rocky shores, you'll find macroalgae and some invertebrate species. It occurs within a tidal inundation. So when it's tidal, it means when it's high tide, they will be covered. When it's low tide, they will be exposed. So that is created a whole ecosystem. I work in estuaries, and the tide is also important there in playing an important part in structuring the type of plants that occurs within a tidal inundation. Some plants are adapted to growing only in the water body. Some can be exposed 12 hours during the day and then inundated 12 hours during the night, and some only at extreme deep times. So how does the moon influence life on Earth? It has created habitat within the intertidal regions of our global system.
Yeah, the tides is definitely a big one. I was trying to think if there's any others.
I was wondering about the lunar cycle itself. I don't talk about the movies where during full moon the wolf comes out.
No, it's not baseless, actually. I want to just say that there's a guy in Pretoria who has been keeping a record of the phases of the moon. And the phases of the moon, like Milankovitch cycles, are another cycle, which have cycles and then longer term cycles. And he's got a very strong theory. He's not alone. He's not a maverick. That the moon indeed does affect climate, and that's through the mechanisms of tidal ranges and various other mechanisms. And it's not to be laughed at, because it's usually, as you just said earlier, the rebels that bring up that change the world. So if it can affect the tea or teacup, the moon, and so it can affect many other things, which it does.
There's light at night. I believe also in humans menstrual cycles. Right?
Absolutely.
But I don't know. I have no idea the mechanism for that. But
we are adapted to our environment in all sorts of ways.
But how would humans know about the moon?
Perception, Carl. Seeing, thinking, feeling.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, think about it. When it's new moon is when they tell you to plant. When there's no moon.
If you can get a fright from reading words, right? I mean, a proper fright. Like you get an email that shocks you, right? You're reading something, your eyes see it, your adrenaline starts pumping, your heart starts pumping. That's a physiological response to a sensation, right? To a sense. Why is others not possible? Which are maybe not as conscious, but still as powerful.
Nice one.
I have a question.
Okay, very quickly.
No, it's from here. Not me this time.
Nonetheless.
And the question was, would the environment that we're living in now be suitable for life that has existed before? It wasn't a meteorite that struck Earth. So in other words, what he's saying is that there was life before.
Dinosaurs.
Things changed, right? And now there's different life, right? And the question is, if the environment changes, would life that might have existed or adapted to different kinds? The answer is yes. And that's exactly what happened. For example, the mammalians became dominant after the reptiles' demise. They were there, they were waiting in the wings. So this is a potential question I'm going to answer later. When the world changes, there will still be life. It'll just be different.
If we brought the reptiles back now, would they be happy? I think not, right? It's too cold.
No, the environments they lived in a different time, had different.
Yeah, but we would just kill them.
Yeah,
As we do.
All right, and on that note, we're going to do our first ever live event tea break. It's just a 5 minutes, so don't go anywhere except to maybe not have a cigarette, Neville, because it's very bad for you. Maybe go to the toilet or grab some food, and we'll be back at 1:15. Okay, we're just taking our seats here in Cape Town. I suggest you guys do the same. Everybody's got some food. Excellent. All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second half of the broadcast. We are going to start a little bit further in the course on the section on plants and biodiversity. Kabir, I hope that your mouth is not too full. Could you possibly just give us a little bit before we start? Why are plants and biodiversity important in understanding a habitable planet?
Okay, so first of all, we know that plants is largely responsible for producing and maintaining oxygen content in our Earth's atmosphere, and that is what we depend on to breathe. So automatically, you can see that we need those plants for a habitable planet. And not only does it maintain and produce these oxygen, it actually supplies all the organic compounds and most of the energy necessarily for life on Earth. Another function of plants would be that it actually keeps our planet cooler. So when the air gets hot, think of how plants, how we sweat to cool ourselves down. Plants transpire to actually release water vapor into the atmosphere, cooling the atmosphere for us to survive, maintaining heat levels. And obviously biodiversity, coming in with plants and animals, is a unique relationship between how plants interact with animals, and whether it's birds that spread the seed of plants, or animals dependent on plants to survive, that complex interaction is what sets off the chain reaction for everything else to occur, for our planet to be habitable, and for us to actually thrive and survive, as we are dependent on all these aspects in our planet.
Nice one, thank you, Kabir. Before we dive into the plants, I think we had one question on the YouTube.
Okay, the question is out of curiosity. Should we be worried about creating a black hole?
And who's that from?
It is from Faith to be there.
Okay, Faith. Should we be worried about creating a black hole? I mean, I guess the question would be how. I wouldn't have thought so. I guess the question comes from experiments like CERN, where they did at one point announce their experiment. I think it was in searching for the Higgs boson, had a very small possibility of creating a big hole, but it didn't. So I guess then no, is the answer. I wouldn't worry too much about it. There are worse things to worry about, I think, much more pressing matters. One of those, it might be our first question in plants and photosynthesis, which comes from Morandeni Nedshaulu. And that's the question is, why are most trees, and I guess that could be extrapolated to plants in general, green in colour? Noabisa, if you want to start with that?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so when you guys were speaking about how the cyanobacteria had a chloroplast and all of that, so the reason why most trees are green in color is because they have a green pigment called chlorophyll. So based on that, that's why they're mostly green in color, because of the pigment that is in the chloroplast, that is chlorophyll.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. The other thing is also that you must keep in mind plants absorb red and blue light in the light spectrum. Okay, so if they absorb the red and the blue light, the chlorophyll then emits sort of the combination, or the spectrum between it is the green light.
Green is reflected.
It's reflected, yes.
So my question, and this goes to anyone in the room, my question on that is why, right? Surely, if you look at the sun spectrum, green is most of it. Why do they just take the blue at one end and the red at the other end and get rid of most of the other? Surely a plant that had black leaves would have a huge evolutionary advantage. Why hasn't a plant with black leaves taken over?
I suppose black leaves would create a thermal pressure on plants.
So they
could absorb
so that's come up before. Then you would expect, my hypothesis I would draw from that is that plants would be greener or white or more lightly coloured at the equator, and at the poles you would have black because heat would be an advantage at the poles.
Neville.
But you don't.
I would say there's probably an optimum,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, look, in any environment, even in Cape Town, we have a lot of exotic plants, and they're chosen because of their unusual colors, for example. So you do get red-leafed plants, for example. Also, marine algae, there are three different fundamental types, colors, if you like. And they all have different photosynthetic pigments.
Yes.
So in general, it's correct to say that green is the dominant one. First of all, there might be an accident of evolutionary history, being one reason for it. But the other is that there's probably an optimum color, you know, for a variety of reasons. Maybe when it's cloudy, that particular frequency of light. You know, we have to research it more and then also hypothesize more.
Can I add a line quickly?
Sure, yeah, I would love to hear from you, Kabir.
Okay, so quickly, what happens is that the red has more photons in its wavelengths, because red has longer wavelengths. So more photons equals more energy, and plants require more energy. So red and blue absorb better than green, and then therefore the green is kicked out as reflective.
But by that logic, blue would be the worst, right? If red is the best,
Blue is the worst.
then why do plants take the blue and not the green?
No, so different plants need different amounts of energy. So a lot of them take the green and the blue rather than the green, I would think.
My proposal, and I don't know, would be that there just isn't the right pigment out there to absorb the green in the middle, or that maybe it would cost too much energy to the pigments that have been. Well,
It works.
So
yeah, but the evolution always often finds that something works better than.
Yes. I suppose I can't optimize.
red algae absorbs clean light, and that is why they are. So
Yeah.
and that is because of the light attenuation in the water, so the light becomes less. So then they will absorb and for them.
But you just wonder why no organisms evolved with all the pigments, just absorb a lot. And maybe the amount of light is very rarely the limiting.
So just to go back to something which I think you said, I forget if you said it earlier, that the origin of photosynthesis are these archaea, these real bacteria, right? We had one origin of photosynthesis.
Yes.
And then, as you all might know, mitochondria and chloroplasts are actually remnants or vestiges of independent organisms. So that's why there's DNA inside the mitochondria and DNA inside the chloroplast, because originally, and it's different DNA, by the way, there's different coding systems slightly. It's actually more primitive, which indicates that even modern organisms, you and me and everyone, have a mitochondrion here. The mitochondrion is actually an alien species. It's another species of bacteria. So maybe if there was a single origin, we kind of trapped in that particular evolution corridor.
All right. Anyway, it's a really interesting question that I could go on for a while and often do discuss with the students at workshops. Sticking with plants, Shandukani Matsozi asks, what role do plants play in air quality? That's a really interesting question. There's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that planting trees in cities has a big role on people's mental health. And you would expect that planting trees in cities would have some positive role in actually producing more oxygen and freshening the air up. But actually, that's often not the case. And in some cases, plants can be harmful. Where I did my PhD, I worked in a research group that studied air quality. I'm an atmospheric chemist originally. And some of the biggest smog events in London happened not because of cars, but because of trees. And quite fascinatingly, when you get high temperatures in the UK, the pine trees release a chemical called isoprene, and that actually causes photochemical smogs. And so some of the biggest smog events they monitored in London are not because of the cars, which are quite well regulated now, not because of the factories, but because the wind turned into a direction that went over plantations of pine trees, and that these released the isoprene.
And then there's pollen.
Pollen, I suppose, is also an air quality issue.
Absolutely.
Especially for those with hay fever, I can imagine that's a big air quality issue. So there's a mixed relationship, I guess. I would much rather live in a city with the trees for their aesthetic value, I think.
And their shade.
And their shade.
And their cooling.
Yeah,
impacts, absolutely. In fact, albedo is another issue. There was a study on that because cities are heat islands, because all the dark and hard surfaces, especially tar growth. So planting trees actually does improve the temperature of the ground. Unquestionably.
So moving from just plants to biodiversity, Abachentre Mikize asks, what's the relationship between evolution and biodiversity? That's quite an interesting and complicated one.
Well, let's start by defining what is evolution. So evolution is descent with modification. That means the descendant or the offspring is different from the parents. What is biodiversity? Biodiversity refers to the variety of plants and animals that inhabit the earth today. These are also considered to tell you about the health of an ecosystem. So basically, biodiversity is evidence of evolution in action. Because as an animal, one of the things you have to remember that two animals that share common traits actually share a common ancestor. But it's due to genetics and inheritance that they are different from their parents, which allows them to adapt to a new environment or changes within the environment, helping them to survive in that environment. So basically, to understand the relationship between evolution and biodiversity basically can be seen as evidence for the evolutionary process.
Okay, that's interesting. And then in terms of the amount of biodiversity and the rate of evolution, they change over time, right? And
yes,
how are they related?
Well, evolution actually is a limiting factor as well as genetics. It does limit the amount of change that is happening. But change only happens really when there's an empty space or an empty niche that needs to be filled. Unless something comes along and, as in the case of war, you obliterate something and make an empty space. Evolution causes change only when there is an empty space to fill.
So in the event of something like a climate change, right, what you're going to get is a massive reduction in biodiversity, but then an increase in the rate of evolution, because then suddenly there's niches to fill.
And timescale issue there.
Yes.
Timescale issue. Losing biodiversity at the sudden evolution takes millions of years.
But the rate would then increase. That would be the...
Yes,
so hundreds of thousands of years.
yeah.
Okay, very interesting. Moving on to sort of specifically how we define biodiversity before we go on to most of your questions are about how we lose it. You guys are a negative bunch. So the one question on how we define it is from Tetelo Masila, who asks, how can beta diversity decrease whilst alpha diversity stays the same or increases? So firstly, the definition of alpha diversity is the number of different species you would find in one specific area in your quadrant if you were doing a quadrant survey.
Can I just modify that?
Yeah.
That is in fact the original traditional definition, but now there's something called functional biodiversity, which doesn't look at the number of species, but the roles the different species play in the ecosystem.
Okay, within one square.
Within one.
Whereas the beta diversity is how does one square compare to another over there? So you could envisage a situation where one changes and the other doesn't. So we could have a situation where you have high alpha diversity, but absolutely zero beta diversity. And that would be if we imagine 4 species, A, B, C, and D. If you find A, B, C, and D here, A, B, C, and D here, and A, B, C, and D here. That's very high alpha diversity, but zero beta diversity. Now imagine that here we just find species A, here species B, here C. We've now got zero alpha diversity, we've just got one species in each grid, but we've got high beta diversity because the difference between the grids, each one is completely different from the other. So I hope that clearly illustrates how those can be separate. Zabutengwa Shongwane asks, how many species go extinct every day? I believe, Neville, you want to go with that.
Yes. Okay. Based on the research that I have done, apparently, scientists or research estimates that 120 to 200 species go extinct every day, which is 100,000 times more than the natural rate of extinction. Yeah, I think it's accelerated by human beings, obviously, based on all the things that we have done, like hence the effects of climate change and so on and so forth, and rhino poaching and all these things that we do to help sort of accelerate the extinction rate. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'll put it open. That's a huge rate, 200 a day. But I think that has to be considered in the context that we don't know most species, right? I don't know if anybody has an idea of how many are discovered a day, but I think it's slightly more than that.
Yeah.
So we're actually discovering slightly more than are going extinct, but nonetheless, also we don't know about the ones we haven't discovered that are going extinct, right? Because we haven't even discovered them to know that they're going extinct. Comes back to Neville's unknown unknowns.
But it doesn't offset the fact that we're losing species by the fact that we don't know they exist. Right?
No, absolutely, obviously.
Yeah.
But it was good that nobody's pointed out that we do always lose species. It's more than the normal, in inverted commas, background rate. Okay, so.
Sorry, Carl.
Yes.
I just can't remember the exact story, but is it not true that the rate at which we are losing species now is equivalent to one of the mass extinctions known on Earth previously? I think I've read that somewhere. I can't remember.
Well, they say we're in the sixth mass extinction.
Right? The mother of all mass extinctions occurred at the Perma-Triassic boundary about 250 odd million years ago. And at that stage, over 70% of the marine fauna and about 60%, 56% of the terrestrial fauna went extinct. And the nice thing in South Africa, we actually see some of the survivors that actually cross that boundary. And potentially the reason they cross that boundary is their ability to be able to use burrows that were existing and to eat food that was the plants that were existing that were tougher and use rhizomes and things like that. So there are animals that are able to cross those boundaries.
Right.
So
I was going to say that with climate change, I mean, diversity also depends on diverse environments. So the more diverse the environment, the more diverse species can evolve into it. And as climate change starts to break down climate zones and spread climate zones and homogenize climate, so we lose the environmental diversity. That's one of the big concerns. And I read a recent paper which showed that a series of extreme events on a scale of days can change an ecosystem function to a different kind of ecosystem. And so it's not just, so it's habitat loss effectively driven by climate change, which is one of the drivers. It's not just that we're directly losing the species, but changing habitat, which changes habitat.
I want to make an important point in terms of the course, that people keep saying this word climate change and habitat loss. It's worth pointing out that in the Habitable Planet course, as you'll all be aware, what we've done is we've slowly built up a model of planet Earth in trying to investigate how the Earth works and what makes it the only habitable planet we know. And we started off with just physical factors, and in this last bit of the course, we've looked at paleontology and biological factors. We haven't yet thought about the impact of humans in the model. In fact, the very next lecture that we're coming up to will be the origins of humans and human evolution, and only then will we then start to really engage with the problems that humans are causing on the planet. But nonetheless, when we do biology and biodiversity, obviously questions come up about the threats to biodiversity. So what I've tried to do is, if your question pertains to human evolution or more specifically to climate change and mitigation adaptation, I'm leaving that for now because we haven't got there yet. But I will do some that are sort of more sitting in the biology section. On that, so we've just heard about this thing, climate change, that we're not supposed to have heard about yet, and habitat loss. And Thabiso Moshupji basically says, with all of these things and this great loss of biodiversity that we've just heard about from Nawabisa, how long it's until, with current levels, that the planet will be uninhabitable? Kabir.
So we know life on Earth, scientists have predicted that life in general will continue for up to 3 billion years. But it's estimated or predicted that humans will die out sooner than those 3 million years. So what will cause this happening is that the Earth will be a hot zone with temperatures so high that even the ocean will evaporate, or all fresh water will evaporate. So my thing is that we have definitely less than 3 billion years. Everything affects human health, whether we have respiratory problems, pests and diseases, health issues. So all these will play a role in a mass extinction of the human race that will slowly happen as those can cope with the environments, those will survive, those will thrive, but eventually within the 3 million years, all life will be gone. Therefore, we think humans, I say, in my personal view, half of that, I think we'd be able to tolerate. The other half with our technology. Some might make it, but again, I don't think we're going to go past that mark. But nothing, I think we have anything to worry about. We're not going to be around that long.
Well, didn't the IPCC just say we've got 12 years and then we're all going to die?
No, 12 years, and so we're all going to start dying in massive numbers.
Yes, so
From that
Kabir
point
says we've got
onwards.
nothing to worry about. We know well, anyway, that's maybe I liked your point about oceans evaporating. It's quite interesting that in our first lecture we learned that Venus should be frigidly cold, and that actually scientists think that's exactly what happened on Venus, that it was a cold planet, and then they had what's called a runaway greenhouse effect, and the oceans did evaporate to turn it into, as we just heard, the sulfuric acid raining hellhole that it's become now. You sort of touched on Julian and Wando's question, Kabir, as to, don't you think technology can save us? Do we really need all these ecosystems? Do you want to say anything else, or are you happy?
Oh yes, no. So let me answer that question as well. So the thing is that if you think about space travel, how do humans live in space for a long time? 6 months, 2 years. Coming back to the topic on the Mars 1 mission, where it's a one-way trip to the red planet. And I'm thinking, how are you going to live there? How can you survive? So I do believe we have the technology, if money was not the issue, but can we survive? Can we support the population, which I don't think is possible. And at that level, it takes a small thing to go wrong for us to obviously, for our technology not to work, or ESCOM power shut down or something that will just wipe our planet out. So yes, I think it's possible if money was not the issue, but we need to look at the Mars missions and the way that space travelers live. Did anyone of you watch the movie The Martian? Maybe there's some truth there. Yes.
Nice one, thanks, Kabir. I actually saw on the news, I didn't realise this until quite late after, back in the UK, a whole city in the northwest lost power for 4 days. And it was quite incredible, the repercussions of losing power for 4 days. I mean, we kind of think, yeah, we know it's South Africans, we've had load shedding. But load shedding is never more than a few hours. 4 days had really, really serious, people died, in quite large numbers. And people just couldn't do the basic things anymore without.
I wonder what would happen if we lost the internet. What that would do to
Well,
us.
that's, as I said, the internet was one of the things that was out,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
There's no phones,
Yeah.
no internet, gone.
I would die.
And talking about dying then,
Yes.
Zandile and Lazi asks, how is life predicted to end according to biology?
Zandile.
Neville, you're a
Okay,
biologist.
so I actually want to answer all three of those questions quickly, just to say, let's just distinguish between the end of life altogether, the end of human life, which is a different thing, and the end of civilization, which is another different thing. Okay, so there's three different things we're talking about here. First of all, I don't think that biology predicts the end of life at all, but for habitability. So in other words, life will go on, life in general, okay? There will always be a form of life as long as the planet is habitable, which Kabir addressed. And I think for me, for the planet to be habitable, there has to be an atmosphere and there has to be a sun. So I think that without those two things, we won't have life on Earth. With those two things, we'll have life on Earth, one way or another. It might not be human life.
So physics predicts that the end of life will be when the sun eats the earth up.
Pretty much,
Yeah.
I imagine. Or if we lose our atmosphere like Mars did, okay, or something like that. And then, of course, when you spoke about the atmosphere, the oceans evaporating, what I thought about, Kabir, was that if the oceans evaporate, but the atmosphere remains, then that water is in the atmosphere, one assumes, right?
Yes.
So therefore, it will rain. Therefore, there's a cycle of life, right? There's the elements of life. So it would be terrible for humans, okay, I imagine. In fact, I think humans will all die. But some form of life will survive and thrive under different environmental circumstances. And then I wanted to say about human civilization. So human civilization is a fairly frequent invention of life, effectively. And it's changed a lot, okay? And I think bioengineering, what's the word they use for it?
Geoengineering.
Geoengineering is a possibility. We could probably create a environment in which humans can survive, but it will be a very different one to the one that we know now. So we speak about, someone asked about forests and wetlands and that. well, those things didn't exist in other times. There were very different kinds of plant regimes, very different kinds of climates, different orient. In fact, if you went back to, please, you can help me with this. If you went back 10 million years, or 20 million years, or 100 million years, or a billion years, when there was life, okay, you went to that planet, you wouldn't call it Earth. It would be a different planet, right? It looked different, different climate, different orientation of continents, different oceans, different animals, different plants, not Earth as we know it.
Yeah.
So potentially, if everything changes, well, you know, it will be poisonous, the new environment, to a lot like oxygen was to life then. It'll be very poisonous, but there will be other life that will adapt.
Yes.
We sort of moved on a little bit to Andani's question about, do you think we'll get to a point where the human species will become extinct? Which I would offer some thoughts on. The first would be, to a first approximation, yes, because if you look back at the fossil record, it's very clear species come and go all the time and nothing lasts forever, right? Yeah. Some species have made it to a few million years, but most hominid species have only made it a few tens of thousands of years.
Including us.
Including us.
150,000, 200,000 years?
Yes, something like that.
Modern humans.
Modern humans.
Okay, 200,000 years. Before that, well, technically we weren't human. They were humanoid, but, you know, so the humans as we know them.
Sure.
Anatomically modern.
Yes.
Thank you. But that having been said, I would follow that up with the second point, that I believe quite strongly that we are the first ever species on this planet to realize that species all come and go. We're the first to investigate that and find it out. And that gives a little bit of a glimmer of hope that actually we are something a bit new and different that the planet hasn't seen before and might manage to get out of that cycle of continuing new species and then extinction, possibly, if we can negotiate our way through problems such as climate change and nuclear war.
Would you say, Carl, that ours is the first conscious species?
The first species.
No, that's not fair. Maybe pre-human, pre-modern human.
I think it's
conscious.
I think it's Brian Cox who says the first collection of atoms that can think about atoms.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't disagree. I mean, I think there's probably a way in which we can sustain human life beyond our sell-by date, right? Yes. How long we can sustain that depends on the resources that will remain available to us.
I think it's Noam Chomsky who pointed out that basically he thinks that the human race is doomed because of nuclear weapons. And or was it Bertrand Russell? I think it was Bertrand Russell who points out that once you have nuclear weapons, the chances of destroying the Earth in any 1 year are non-zero, and therefore you only have to extrapolate forward enough number of years, and it will happen eventually. Eventually, there will be somebody stupid enough to press the button.
Actually, I think we'll die from other sources before we die of nuclear war.
Yeah, I think he was writing in the 50s. When nuclear war was
climate
change wasn't. Yeah. Absolutely. But it's a really fascinating question, one which, you know, I hope to be around not to find out about the end anyway. Okay, moving on. I think we skipped one. Oh, alien invasives was one of the questions that came up a couple of times. I have Papama Yose's question here, which is, can we say the alien invasive species are causing biodiversity loss or threatening it when they have benefits to the environment or humans, e.g. they provide ecosystem services? Dimitri or Kabir? Kabir looks like he's not there, so I'm going to go to Dimitri.
Okay, so when you think about ecosystem services, we talk about the goods, not just the goods, but the things that we can't really put into monetary value that the Earth provides, okay? So if you look in areas such as Cape Town or basically just all over South Africa, there's a lot of invasive alien plants. And it has been shown that they do decrease biodiversity. They do result in biodiversity loss. But then you think about what benefits the alien invasive plants here for Earth or for a certain area. It is far less than the ecosystem services that native species, that indigenous species do provide. So if you had to compare the stream flow, which if you take a river, it's full of invasive plants, the stream flow will be reduced, so some areas will get river water, that is a negative impact of alien invasive plants. And then compare that to the timber that it produces. Obviously, we all need fresh water to drink. Timber we can go without. Okay, so the impact is far more greater. Invasive alien plants have a far more greater impact, negative impact on our natural ecosystems. Should be, but we don't conserve. Also, we don't conserve these plants, but we manage them. We don't conserve alien invasive plants. We manage them, and there's lots of laws in South Africa that allows you to grow invasive alien plants such as pine and the acacia manzia, as is mentioned there. But it's important that we manage it and not decrease our natural biodiversity.
Okay, Kabir, you have any comment on alien invasives, cost benefits?
Just a quick one. What Dimitri said is that we should look at or tree farming or the benefits of acacia as a crop. So just like how you would plant maize, which is an exotic species, or plant cabbages, you are planting trees. So as long as it's managed, it's fine. As soon as it escapes, then it becomes aggressively taking up much more resources, and then there it should be a problem. So look at the two separately, and then you actually draw the line between it's an invasive, yes, but in a different ideology, it's actually a crop.
I think I'm counted as an alien invasive, right? But I don't think I'm.
There's a whole industry on the West Coast for mussel ranching, which is alien species.
And they've the mussels along the West Coast, how good they destroyed the intertidal areas. So that was a loss of biodiversity, but there's some monetary value that's associated with it.
Now, 3 questions here.
I'm going to come to them at the end of the section, because there's just one at the end of the section to finish it off. On Ntombokolo Matamayo says, is the amount of melanin going to be one of the main factors in human survival under climate change? And so that's a quite interesting one. He's saying as the planet gets hotter, is it going to be important to have more melanin in your skin? Actually, it links a little bit back to the will humans become extinct. One quick point is that if they don't become extinct, they will certainly change. Actually, if we went back to our hominid ancestors, they would look very different to us. And I'm sure if we went 500,000 years in the future, if we're still around, we will probably look very different. And also, actually, quite possibly not through evolution, but through the fact that we start editing our own genes and actually changing ourselves. Okay, but that aside, would melanin be an advantage? The answer is almost certainly no. And the reason for that being is climate change isn't going to happen because we are getting more sunlight coming in, right? Melanin is an adaptation to higher amounts of incoming solar radiation and incoming UV. Climate change happens because more of the long-wave radiation gets trapped that's re-emitted by the Earth. So therefore, although the planet's getting hotter, it's not because there's more UVA and UVB, and therefore I would have thought melanin would be redundant.
I mean, if anything, we spend more time indoors.
Yeah,
that's
but also, I mean, I think people have adapted now. We wear clothes. We're not running around naked outside. So I think that the role of skin color in a biological sense is kind of.
And we have sunblock.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the end of that section. I believe we've got some questions.
Yeah. So the first question was, with the technology so advanced, do you think that there's anything that would wipe out human species? And someone want to try and answer that one?
With technology is sufficiently advanced, is there anything that would wipe out the human species? I mean, a comet.
Yeah.
Well, I think technology itself might wipe out humans.
Yeah, that's true.
Actually, let's not forget about artificial intelligence and the nightmare scenario where the computer says, well, we're better off without you guys, actually. But that's not what I meant. I mean, I don't think technology is going to save us in and of itself. It may save some of us, if we're rich enough, not all of us.
That's also possible. Stephen Hawking makes an interesting point on that one as well. That he points out that if anybody programmed an artificial intelligence that was smarter than humans, the first thing it would do is look at its own programming and say, I was programmed by a moron. I can do this better, and reprogram itself. But now it will be smarter than itself. Yeah. So then it would look at its programming and say, I was programmed, and that would snowball into this super incredible being, which would then definitely regard us as just primordial bacteria.
Like
and just, get rid of it.
The second question is, what is it going to take for life to be completely wiped out on the face of the Earth.
God, you guys are so miserable.
I think we answered that question.
Yeah.
In my view, for there to be no life, it has to be a planet like Mars with no atmosphere and or no sun. Okay, so that would be the answer to that one. Otherwise, I think life will exist. And then the last question is, what are other factors that affect phytoplankton blooms besides iron fertilization in the Southern Ocean?
Okay, that's less miserable, and we have
Well,
we have a marine biologist, or two, in
so
fact.
all phytoplankton blooms are really a result of the bringing together of three things. One is nutrients, a stable thermocline or a water body which is stable in the sunlight, and some plankton. Put those together, and then you've got a bloom. And the bloom will always grow when there are nutrients, which are always limiting. So iron is one of the limiting ones, but there are other limiting ones. And so you often get a cycle of blooms, and you get conditions which are conducive to blooms. Usually we see blooms in the spring, and that's when the thermocline forms because the sunlight is there for longer, water warms up the top, so it keeps stuff up in the top part of the ocean, and it's got all the fresh upwelled water, and we've got the sunlight. So that's where we have a bloom. Usually then it uses up all those nutrients and then dies. So it's not just iron that's limiting, although iron is always limiting.
Okay.
And we've got a picture from you, Jay. Hello, you, Jay.
Hello, you Jay.
Okay. There's one question on faith again. Which animal is the most threatened with extinction?
Oh, that's a good question. To which I don't know the answer.
Which is
the animal currently most threatened with extinction?
Oh, I think
In terms of animals,
you can take a pick. I mean, I don't know, offhand. I mean, there's a whole categorization.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just go look up Red List.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean,
The ones that are extinct in the wild are
is that-
most threatened.
I think
with
you're probably right.
extinction.
That's probably correct.
Instead of rhinos in the wild, but
Yes.
it's probably in a zoo
I
or
saw-
somewhere.
I think it was the last northern white rhino died the other day. But until then, that would have been them, I suppose, given that there was only a male left.
Sure.
So any species where there's only a male or only a female left have definitely got to be the most threatened, I would have thought. And there's quite a few of them.
I'm sure. But there are species on endangered species. There's an endangered species list.
Yes.
You can look it up. And also CITES has a list. There's banned trade in some animals, you know, those kinds of things. Go ahead.
And what makes a species disappear?
Yeah, I guess a whole bunch of factors can contribute.
Habitat destruction
for
is
some
one
Habitat
of them.
destruction is a key one. Mostly animals that have value are the ones that go first. There's a fantastic book called History of Fishing. And they talk about, the history of fishing is fascinating. So they talk about the new lands. So that means when they went to America, the Europeans went to America and they started fishing, as in they did for everything, harvesting resources. And what happened was they said there was more fish than there was ocean, right? There was so much fish. It's an exaggeration, of course. But there are all sorts of species there that were just basically hunted out. In fact, South Africa's also got a legacy of that kind of stuff. You know, there were lions and rhino all around here in the mountains in the Cape, for example, all hunted out. Everything that has value. In fact, I like to talk about this book a lot, which is one I'm still busy reading, called Sapiens. And if you haven't read it, go get it and read it. It's by a guy called Yuval Harari, okay? And it's basically the history of the human species. And he spends quite a bit of time talking about how humans, wherever humans have evolved or have moved to, the first thing that happens is the big mammals disappear, okay? Followed by that other mammals and so on and so forth. And one of the tragedies I find, there are many, many stories like this, but I went, when I was very lucky to go and do a postdoc in Australia, I went and stayed in Tasmania. And in Tasmania, there was an animal called the hyacinth, or not the hyacinth, the thylacine, also known as a Tasmanian tiger. It was the only marsupial carnivore. Okay, no, looked like a tiger, like a dog with stripes, basically. Okay, and they've got footage of them, so that they lived up until the point at which there was still photography. And they had video. They have video today of the animals. Now they're none left. Okay, because they were killing the sheep which they brought, right? So they went and hunted them out, killed them. And now they're none left. And I find it very tragic because they lived long enough for us to almost be able to save them, but not quite.
What's fascinating is that in those big mammals, it's not just the prey that's included, but other hominids. Well, can we come on to human evolution now? That actually the normal state for planet Earth is that there's more than one, in fact, many hominids on the planet. We killed all the others off. That's quite a sobering thought. So made this unusual situation where we're the only hominids.
So there's a lot of time dedicated to that by Yuval Harari in his book. He talks about there being 6 human species coexistent at the same time, right? 6, of which our species pretty much wiped them all out, or interbred with them, which is still out there, but pretty much the theory is we have got quite a bit of Neanderthal DNA in us.
We'll come to all of that.
Yeah.
Any others? Okay, brilliant. We can move on. We're nearly done. There's just 2 short sections left. The penultimate one being the biogeochemistry, which we've just come on to this week. So if anybody has any burning biogeochemistry questions, please do send them in while we have a quick look at the ones we do have. The one of them comes from Nosikelelo Sibisi. Nosikelelo asks, how is the Earth able to keep a steady supply of liquid water without having it freeze or dry out? I mean, very, very briefly, 2 fundamental factors to that. One, as we learned in the physics part of the course, the Earth keeps a steady temperature in around the right area. 15 degrees is the average temperature of the Earth. That's not too hot for the water to boil and not too cold for the water to freeze on average. But most importantly, as we saw in the biogeochemistry talks, water is recycled. It's a stable chemical, it doesn't break down, and the Earth is effectively an isolated system. So it can't leave the Earth system, it just gets recycled from the oceans to the atmosphere, through the land, biota and rocks, and back again. So an isolated system, recycling, is really the answer to that question. And the only other one in this section was Siatemba Ngbani, who asks, how does biology contribute to making the Earth habitable?
I think Kabir sort of touched on it, right? He explained it quite decently.
In terms of photosynthesis.
So what do you want me to?
No, carry on. I'm asking that what you mean.
No, Kabir explained how plants and animals and biodiversity and their role in making the Earth habitable. I think he probably touched it.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is in terms of nutrients, that organisms recycle nutrients on top of. So Kabir touched on it in terms of energy. That the plants take the energy, it gets passed up. But nutrients important too, also get recycled around. Yeah, I think that's about all for that section. Nothing online.
I'm just looking at the sad footage of last Tasmanian tiger.
Shane, you have to share that with us. Your last chance for anybody online to ask a question before I close up is in the miscellaneous section. I normally have a bunch of quite zany questions from you guys to fill the miscellaneous section. This time we only have the one, which is from Vuiseka Lokaza, which is the 5-second rule true or a myth? Which I presume refers to the rule of dropping food on the floor and the time in which you can pick it up. And I actually seen a study on this, and the answer is yes, it is a myth. I mean, the amount of that
I eat it all the time.
Well, I'm getting there. The amount of bacteria transferred will depend on a huge range of factors. A big one is the moisture level, how wet your sample is. Bacteria, obviously, if you drop your food in a puddle, then more bacteria are transferred than if you drop it in a completely dry tile. And then also the aggregation of the material. If you drop it in sand, then you're going to get more bacteria because they're going to hop on the sand. There's nothing to suggest, though, that 5 seconds is safe from bacteria. On the other hand, the chances of you getting sick from dropping something on the floor is very slim, so I would recommend just eating it. That's my thoughts.
The Mythbusters, if you know that program, they did a test on it as well. I have a question here, which is just basically something we've already answered, which is, is there any chance that artificial intelligence would be against us and decide, no, they're better off without us?
Yes.
And the answer is yes, I'm sure that is true. That's what the biggest fear is. I mean, these people do come radical experiments, right? In fact, I saw a video the other day that they programmed a computer they stuck a human head on it, well, a humanoid head on it, it's just a computer, to give a lecture on ethics. Interestingly, right? You can Google this. It gave a lecture on ethics to real students. And the experiment was not to gauge the power of the computer, but to gauge the reaction of the students. Not that they didn't know, they knew it was a robot, but they wanted to know, did they find the lecture interesting? Did they find it meaningful? Was the robot able to answer questions, which it was apparently, you know? And the question is, what the hell is the point of that? What are you trying to achieve, really? It's the same as people that are trying to clone other people. I mean, it's all very interesting and all that, but to what end exactly? So the ethics of the research becomes questionable. But I think the scenario where artificial intelligence will outdo us, what does outdo us? I mean, your computer outdoes you. You can do calculations quicker than you, right?
Yeah.
That's given. Whether we'll become redundant or not, I don't know. I think we will.
Anything on YouTube on that cheery thoughts?
Just a question, I think.
All good. All right, super. I'm very pleased that for once we've managed to finish on time. That's great stuff. Just to round off, thanks very much everybody for joining us everywhere across the country. I'd like to thank my panel members here in Cape Town as well as across in KZN. Thanks everybody for dedicating your time to answer the students' questions. To those on the online course, please don't forget to get your exams in on time by Sunday to make it above the Limpopo line, or at least to get to the 50% so you get a completion certificate. Is there a sec?
Oh, it is the Limpopo line.
Oh, well, they know what the Limpopo line is. So the top students on the course are joining us for the Global Change Grand Challenge conference in Limpopo.
Okay.
So on the exam result table, there is a line which has then become known as the Limpopo line.
And let me just say that it's shaping up to be a really interesting conference. There's going to be at least 450 people there. Access is going to have at least 2 events, if not more, if we can get it together. And many Access students will be presenting. Like 20 of our previous phase Access students and about. You're welcome. Anyway, there it is. So I'm looking forward to seeing everyone there.
Thanks very much, everybody. And just last thing, this doesn't have to be the end for those watching in the group sessions. I hope there's still some food left and there's still some people to talk to. Please do meet the other students on the course. If you've got questions, they're a great resource to discuss, to check out what's happening, discuss the exam questions, etc. So I hope you guys have enjoyed, and thank you very much. Cheers.
Bye.